Hello and welcome to Uncle Cthulhu Reviews. Today I'll do part two of Britain's military heritage, looking at what I consider Britain's greatest military victories. Now the defeats I managed to pull down into top five, so I would do have a top five what I consider Britain's greatest military victories are, but I've also got some honourable and special mentions. So in no order for the special mentions, let's start off with Agincourt. So Agincourt, great British, British military victory in that it was a tactical triumph over the French. We knew what our strengths were, we knew what the enemy's weaknesses were, we put the tactics in place and we beat the French. I would also mention that I'm only looking at sort of Britain and England versus external enemies rather than, say, the English Civil Wars or the Scots-English Wars. So other special mention, the Battle of Vittoria in Spain basically smashed any chance that the French had in Spain of doing anything. It was the end of the French rule in Spain virtually. Special mention, Jutland. So it wasn't really a British victory on the ground, but I think it was Jellicoe that famously said only he had the power to lose the First World War in an afternoon. So what he did was play for a score draw, and he got his score draw, blunted the designs on the German fleet, sent them back into harbour, didn't really excel himself, possibly considered a British minor defeat, but strategically it meant that the German Navy wasn't going to take any further part in the war. Other special mentions would be the Battle of the Imjin during the Korean War. So, for a democracy, a Western democracy, post-World War II, we don't expect our troops to fight to the last. And actually what our army was able to do in Korea at the time was we stood toe-to-toe against the communist forces, and we were outnumbered 5 or 6 to 1, including a brilliant last stand by the Gloucester Regiment, defending a hill for over 400. The whole battalion basically stood and fought. And the severity of the Korean War is often overlooked as a post-war conflict that Britain was involved in. And it's one of those things that if you actually look at the Korean War and the scale of the war, for democracies, for Western democracies, post World War II, the scale of the fighting, by our ken and knowledge of war, was frightening. Second, from last honourable mention, would be the Falklands War. If I was a betting man and I looked at the odds of that war, I'd have probably said the Argentinians had pulled enough political capital out of it to create a draw at the very least. The fact that we had to send a fleet so far down, if the Argentinians had dominated the air and prevented the fleet from getting ground forces truly established, that was their chance of victory. Once our army was on the ground, our army was far superior to the Argentinian one on the force, and I'd have no doubt that our brave soldiers would have been able to liberate the Falklands. But actually, like I say, coming down, I'd have doubted that our Navy could have pulled that off. And we saw the horrific losses our Navy sustained from Argentinian air attacks. So whatever gods were smiling on the British task force, I think, that was a military victory which was unexpected. And the last one that didn't make my top five, and it will often make top fives, is Battle for Trafalgar. Trafalgar was a stunning British victory. It smashed the French and the Spanish fleets, meant that Britain was safe from invasion, and Napoleon's naval ambitions were shattered. It sounds good, strategically important, but it didn't finish a war. And that's the thing with a lot of our naval conflicts, is our Navy's very good at stopping us being invaded and allowing us to project force, but on its own won't finish a conflict. So, top 5 battles, Britain's greatest military victories. Number 5, El Alamein. Second El Alamein, Monty built up overwhelming advantage in both equipment, materials, men, rebuilt the morale of the Desert Army, and over 3 days, punishing days, blunted Rommel's nose and forced him back. Looking at the numbers, it's hard to see how Rommel could have forced the win, but bear in mind the Germans had just a couple of years earlier blitzkrieged through Europe. They had a lot of positives going for them. But most importantly, what Monty did was give the Allies a victory. The Allies in the Far East was reeling from the Japanese aggression. I don't quite know. Yeah, it must have been, it was 1942. Yeah, anyway, the Allies had suffered defeat after defeat after defeat. This was our first major and biggest win against the Axis powers to date. 4th, Battle for Britain. Now, everything I just said about Trafalgar is true, but more. So, even if Napoleon had managed to get a fleet and invade Britain, I still don't think Napoleon would have been able to supply and support that army during the Napoleonic Wars. So whilst Trafalgar was significant, it wasn't Battle of Britain. Battle of Britain was fighting a war at a new level. So air war, the Luftwaffe could have devastated and destroyed British fleets, pummeled our lands, and supported an army to be able to engage and invade Britain, which would have stood the best chance of any army invading it. And certainly there's key points in the Battle of Britain where the Germans could have tipped the advantage in their favour. So they stopped bombing airfields and switched to civilian targets of cities too early. So the Battle of Britain certainly saved us from a Nazi invasion. And if there was any war we had to win as a nation, that was the war. Up until that point, any other war would have been a negotiated settlement between either royal dynasties or governments that kind of would have been relatively reasonable. But if the Second World War, if there was one war we had to win, it was that. So that was number 4. Number 3, Salamanca. This was the battle which showed Wellington as not just a defensive general, but an aggressive general. And I mentioned Vittoria earlier, which totally wiped out any chance of France and Spain. Salamanca was a battle which broke the hold on Spain, which pretty much meant that the Allies were going to win the battle for the Iberian Peninsula. We were fighting a decent French army in the field. The army in Vittoria wasn't quite up to scratch compared with Salamanca. And favour was with Wellington. I think the French general was wounded in the first 5 minutes of the battle. It's not going to help. But yeah, Salamanca. Second greatest British military victory with Blenheim. So a British army landed on the continent, virtually marched all the way to Austria, keeping its formation and discipline, joined an Allied army, smashed the French army. Significant because up to that point in the war, the French hadn't been defeated, and the army got there in time with its allies, kept Austria in the war, which went on. I think Ramillies was the battle which kind of finished that conflict, and Sir John Churchill, the Duke of Marlborough, is a much underrated British hero in my opinion. Leaving Britain's greatest military victory, which I've got to say is Waterloo. So what happened at Waterloo? Wellington expected his army to perform a certain way. The army performed a certain way. We defeated Napoleon. We doubtful whether we'd have been able to defeat Napoleon without Prussian allies, but that was a point of how we'd set up. That was a point of Napoleon's tactics, taking that into account. It was a tactical victory. Wellington knew how a British army fought. Wellington knew how a French army fought, and his battle plans revolved around that. They may not have been the most exciting of battle plans. Basically, nail yourself just on the other side of a ridge and hammer the French columns as they come up. Hold some key fortifications and hold until night or Blucher turning up. But he knew it, the army could do it. But actually, that was the end of Napoleon, and it heralded one of the longest eras of peace on the continent that continental Europe's ever had. I think certainly Britain wasn't involved in the continent for another 100 years, but it's about 50 years of relative peace and stability up until the unification of Germany that Waterloo was able to bring, which not many battles can say it brought so much peace. Now, I haven't mentioned any World War II battles, and certainly I have mentioned some World War II battles. I've mentioned El Alamein. I haven't mentioned, say, the ones in Europe, Northwest Europe at the time. Certainly were notable battles, but it was part of a grindfest. There was no real stunning victory where Britain stood mainly on its own. D-Day landings, for example, unbelievable feat of military logistics. I can't even start to comprehend the thoughts and the plannings that go into that. But day one, we didn't reach our objective, which was Caen, and I think it took at least a month or more to get to Caen. Nothing else that we were able to do against Germany led to significant tactical or strategic victories. It was a slow grind. The Scheldt, a brutal battle, a victory for us, but there was nothing decisive about it. Monte Cassino, a great victory in itself, but again, it was months of slogging, and by the time we broke through at Monte Cassino, we had another German line to go through. The final battles in Burma will be worth mentioning. The British defence of India in 1944, Japan's last gamble, when Britain also had political considerations to make with the independence movement in India. And then finally the attack on Rangoon and Mandalay, and the brutal city fighting that we had to embark on against the Japanese. All strategically important. But yeah, so in summary, my top 5 Britain's greatest military victories: El Alamein, Battle of Britain, Salamanca, Blenheim, and Waterloo. So let me know your thoughts, and I look forward to hearing from you in future. Thanks for watching.